Okay, so this is going to be my second episode of my podcast called Language Learners and Language Lecturers, where I talk to teachers about languages and related fields. So, my first guest was from Macaulay. Now I'm talking to somebody from Baylor, a rivaling school. So, Mr. Swakopf. Ja. Ich vermute, wir haben diskutiert, dass wir in Deutsch reden wollen.
Ja,
okay.
Das klingt gut.
Naja, herzlich willkommen.
Danke sehr.
Sie kennenzulernen.
Ja, ich freue mich sehr, hier dabei zu sein. Und
Bist du nervös?
Ein bisschen nervös. Es ist so eine neue Erfahrung für mich. Also hier vor einer Kamera zu sitzen und zu plaudern. Aber normalerweise ist es...
Ich auch schon. Ich meine... Das hier ist nicht vollkommen neu, aber ich habe es nur einmal getan. Also.
Ja, und auf Deutsch?
Nein. Niemals. Nur auf Englisch.
Ja. Okay.
Ja, also das ist absolut begeistert. Alright. Meine erste Frage ist, lassen wir uns sehen hier. Warum hast du die Zeit genommen, hier auf diesem Podcast zu sein?
Ja. Erstens, ehrlich gesagt, weil ich mich geschmeichelt gefühlt habe. Das ist sehr nett von dir zu fragen, ob ich hier sein will. Ich finde das gut, was du hier tust, dass du nach Lehrern und Lehrerinnen suchst und interviewst, um zu sehen, wie die Situation im Klassenzimmer ist. Ich finde das sehr, sehr wichtig und spannend und auch, weil einfach nur selten fragt man, hey, möchtest du über Sprachen und Sprachwissenschaft und Fremdsprachen reden?
Definitiv
und
nicht
also
möglich.
ich ergreife die Gelegenheit, das zu machen. Das ist, ja. Mhm.
Wann ist das letzte Mal, in dem du Deutsch gesprochen hast?
Ja, es ist nicht sehr oft. Also ich glaube, im letzten Monat auf jeden Fall, weil die neue Deutschlehrerin bei Baylor, die nächstes Jahr kommt, sie ist vorbeigekommen, um meinen Unterricht zu beobachten.
Okay.
Und wir haben ein bisschen auf Deutsch geredet, aber der Tagesplan ist immer sehr zickzack. Wir hatten nicht viel Zeit zu reden. Und also davor, vielleicht vor ein paar Monaten. Es gibt einen kleinen Stammtisch hier in Chattanooga. Ein paar Leute, keine Muttersprachler, aber Leute, die Deutsch können. Und wir treffen einmal im Monat in einem Café und wir reden.
Ist das ein Baylor-Ding?
Nein, das ist eigentlich organisiert von einem ehemaligen Professor von UTC. Und er macht das. Er ist super nett und organisiert alles und schickt die Einladung. Wow. Ich kann dir die Details geben.
Ja. Wo treffen Sie?
Wo? In einem Café. Ich vergesse den Namen im Moment. Das ist in der Nähe von Chatprep.
Chatprep. Ich habe davon nicht gehört. Muss es überprüfen.
Ja, es ist nicht weit weg. Es ist in der Stadt, im Stadtzentrum.
Downtown Chat?
Okay. Ja, genau. Ja, ich schicke dir die Details
für
nächstes Mal. Das ist nicht jeden Monat.
Nicht jeden Monat.
Im Sommer machen wir eine Pause.
Gesehen. Ja. Naja, bis zu meiner nächsten Frage. Warst du schon mal in Deutschland, Österreich oder der Schweiz?
Ja, niemals in Österreich oder in der Schweiz, aber schon in Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal eigentlich mit meiner Familie, als ich Teenager war.
Okay.
Vielleicht 13 oder 14 hatte ich die Gelegenheit, weil ich bin mit meiner Schwester, meinem Vater, meiner Mutter nach Deutschland geflogen, um meine Tante, meinen Onkel, meine Cousins zu besuchen. Sie waren 2 Jahre da wegen wegen der Arbeit von meinem Onkel. War 2 Jahre und also wir hatten die Gelegenheit, dahin zu reisen. Leider habe ich erinnere nicht viel an die Reise. Ich war schlecht gelaunt. Ich weiß nicht warum, weil ich ein Teenager war. Genau. Und leider habe ich die Zeit und die Erfahrung verschwendet. Das war
damals, ich vermute, du könntest kein Deutsch, oder?
Genau. Ja, kein Wort Deutsch. Ja. Mhm. Und auch meine Familie und auch, also es war es war cool, aber nicht die beste Reise.
Ich schätze, das ist eigentlich für ewig bei Amerikanern in Deutschland. Ich meine, es gibt so viele Leute hier, die Relativen in Deutschland haben. Es ist sehr üblich, aber die Chancen, Amerikaner gut in Deutschland zu können, ist leider sehr niedrig, ich denke.
Das ist mir eine Überraschung, wenn Sie einen treffen. Ja, und dann zum zweiten Mal ein bisschen später. Ich war in Undergrad. Ich bin dahin gefahren, um mein Auslandsstudium zu machen.
Okay.
Also das war in meinem 3. Jahr an der Uni. Und das hat 2,5 Monate gedauert, also kein volles Semester, aber 2,5 Monate. 1 Monat in München und dann 1,5 Monate in Göttingen, ganz zentral in der Mitte Deutschlands. Und das war eine gute Erfahrung. Mein Deutsch hat sich verbessert, natürlich.
Ja.
Aber es war ein gemischtes Erlebnis. Also, was ich da meine, es war sehr, sehr einsam. Ich war allein zum ersten Mal im Ausland und ich hatte kein Handy. Und ich bin sehr introvertiert.
Ja.
Also ich war fast die ganze Zeit allein, besonders in München, weil ich habe das Auslandsstudium am Goethe-Institut gemacht, also nicht an einer Universität. Es ist ein privates Institut und es war günstiger, nicht so teuer. Und das Haus, also Studentenwohnheim, war 15 Minuten entfernt von der Schule. Also es gab Pendelzeit hin und her und also keine Gemeinde unter den Kursteilnehmer. Also ich war in der Schule. Bist du da
gefahren oder nutzest du den
im Zug?
Okay.
Ja, mit der U-Bahn, S-Bahn. Also es war einfach dahin hin und her. Aber also das Resultat war, dass ich war in der Schule und dann am Abend nur
was tue ich jetzt?
Und dann repeat. Ja, das ist und Göttingen war das ein bisschen besser, weil ging's besser, weil das Haus war im gleichen Gebäude wie die Schule. Und also dann war es bequemer zu sagen nach dem Unterricht, hey, wir gehen und holen ein Bier oder einen Kaffee, kommst du mit? Also dann hatte ich ein paar Freunde, endlich. Und es war nicht so einsam.
Sicher hättest du ein paar mehr Freunde, als du der länger wärst.
Bitte?
Du hättest für mich mehr Freunde, als du dort länger geblieben wurde. Ich meine, du warst nicht dafür so lange. Freunde können ein bisschen lange dauern zu kriegen, wenn du in einem Ort bist. Deutschland schon ist es dann ein bisschen introvertiert, als ich verstehe.
Genau, das war auch das Problem, weil ich passe sehr gut an der Kultur, weil ich introvertiert bin, aber das ist dann schwer, Kontakte zu schließen. Und eigentlich war es ein paar Brasilianer, die da waren, um Deutsch zu lernen. Die haben gesagt, hey, was machst du da in der Ecke mit deinem Buch? Komm mal mit. Ja. Und ich habe gesagt, danke, ja. Ich gehe gern mit euch. Ja, also ich habe meine Zeit mit Brasilianern und mit einem Italiener und mit einem Ungarer verbracht. Und nicht mit Deutschen. Und das war...
Ironisch.
Ja, ironisch, ein bisschen ironisch. Aber zumindest haben wir sehr wenig Englisch gesprochen.
Ja,
und das war der Schwerpunkt. Ja.
Ja. Die sind schwer zu kriegen, aber falls du einen deutschen Freund kriegst, dann sind sie Freunde fürs Leben. Ich habe einen Freund.
Okay.
Ups. Ich traf ihn in New Orleans, was auch ironisch ist.
Okay.
Aber es gab einen Club namens Deutsches Haus und eigentlich, wir haben Englisch gesprochen, aber ich bemerkte, dass er ein deutsches Akzent hat. Und da fragte ich, hey, woher kommst du? Ich sag, oh, Deutschland. Oh, wirklich? Ja, das ist, wie unsere Freundschaft begonnen hat.
Okay,
so.
Schön.
Also, nächste Frage. Okay. Wie klar kommst du mit so vielen Dialekten? Das ist in Bezug auf Deutsch.
Ja, ich komme nicht klar mit den Dialekten. Also ich würde sagen, mein Deutsch ist Standarddeutsch. Und ich meine nicht damit, dass ich immer richtig spreche, dass ich immer grammatikalisch perfekt bin. Aber ich würde schätzen, 80% von meinem Deutsch leitet sich aus Büchern her. Und also dann die geschriebene Sprache ist mein Deutsch. Ja. Also ich habe sehr wenig Erfahrung eigentlich im Sprechen, im Vergleich zu Lesen und Hören zum Beispiel. Also dann mit Dialekten, ich liebe, dass Deutsch so reich an Dialekten ist. Und ich mag besonders gern Schweizerdeutsch.
Oh,
ich kann das nicht, ich kann fast kein Wort verstehen, aber...
die meisten Deutsche kann das gar nicht verstehen.
Genau. Ja, aber ja, das war kein Problem, als ich in Deutschland war. Vielleicht nur in einer Kneipe in München, wo Bayerisch gesprochen wurde. Aber
das war eine solche kleine Frage, die ich hatte. Wie war deine Erfahrung in München mit den Bayerisch?
Ja, wie gesagt, ich habe nicht sehr viel mit Leuten überhaupt gesprochen, aber wenn, dann war es relativ kein Problem.
Das ist der Großstadt. Also ich vermute, dass es gibt weniger Bayerisch in München gesprochen als in anderen Teilen von Bayern.
Genau, ja. Und das ist ein großes Bundesland. Ja, es gibt, ja. Und ja, zum Beispiel, also eine Freundin von mir aus Deutschland kommt aus Schwaben im Süden und spricht Schwäbisch. Und ich kann da kein Wort verstehen. Ich mag das, es klingt so cool und schön. Und sie sagt immer, als sie groß gewachsen ist, ja, meine Muttersprache ist Schwäbisch, meine erste Fremdsprache ist Deutsch.
Fremdsprache?
Ja, das war für sie eine Fremdsprache zu lernen in der Schule, weil das so unterschiedlich war von ihrem Dialekt. Und also das ist sehr beeindruckend dann, wenn man einen regionalen Dialekt zu Hause spricht. Dann muss man Standarddeutsch in der Schule lernen und dann dazu Englisch und vielleicht noch eine Fremdsprache dann.
Ich habe sehr oft versucht zu erklären, dass die Dialekte auf Deutsch sind vollkommen anders als was Dialekten auf Englisch angeht oder Französisch oder Spanisch. Das ist nicht dasselbe.
Ja, das ist nicht nur ein Akzent.
Nein,
es
ist vermutlich der Schweizerdeutsch zum Beispiel mir klingt es als eine vollkommen andere Sprache, so wie Niederländisch oder sowas.
Ja. Ja. Und das ist Sprachwissenschaftler vielleicht würde sagen, ja, das ist eher noch eine andere Sprache, aber
Das ist
ob
zu weit weg.
etwas also die Frage, ob etwas ein Dialekt oder eine Sprache ist immer eine quasi politische Frage.
Ja,
und,
natürlich. Ich meine, Norwegisch, Danisch und Schwedisch. Ich meine,
Genau.
Danisch und Norwegisch auf dem Papier sehen extrem ähnlich aus, aber wenn man zuhört, dann ist es vollkommen anders. Ja, so. Ich komme nicht schon klar mit solchen Dialekten auch. Hochdeutsch schon, aber ich meine, und ein paar andere Dialekten aus Deutschland, in dem ich Podcasts auch zugehört habe und dann, oh, das ist ein anderer Dialekt. Ja, es klang ein bisschen seltsam aus, aber trotzdem kann ich es anhören und ein bisschen verstehen. So. Ja, aber manche Dialekte aus Deutsch klingen, also ich kann es nur vergleichen mit, du weißt schon, mit den Irish English oder sowas, aber auf Deutsch, solcher Akzent, es ist sehr, sehr seltsam, das zu erfahren, dass so eine Dialekt könnte so ähnlich anhören. Also meine dritte Frage, ich denke, vielleicht dritte oder vierte. Vierte. So. Wie lange her ist es, dass du in Deutsch an einem Gespräch überhaupt gesprochen hast? Du hast das schon beantwortet. Also, ich denke, wir können auf den englischen Teil jetzt konzentrieren.
Genau,
Oder
ins Englische wechseln. Ja,
also,
sehr gern.
That's all for German.
Yeah, we'll do English now.
Yeah. But you speak very well.
Oh,
You speak
well,
very
thank
well.
you.
Yeah.
You as well. That's great. We hadn't really spoken in
No,
German.
we've never spoken
before,
in
so
German
that was
ever. Never. So I was wondering how that was going to go.
Yeah.
It's been literally over a month since I've spoken to anyone in German. So even my friend from Germany, we always speak in English. So
it's not often that I do. I mean, it's especially now that I'm away from like the German graduate studies department that I was in before moving back to Chattanooga, and it's especially hard. Even the German speakers that I know, we already have an established rapport in English.
Exactly.
And once we sort of identify people with languages. Once you kind of have that habit in place, it's really hard. It's like fighting against gravity to try and then speak a different language with them.
It is because, you start talking in English with them and it just feels weird to change that dynamic to another language. You know?
Yeah. So it's sort of, I mean, it's like you get, you meet someone that speaks German and you just start right from the bat speaking German.
Totally different.
Yeah.
Totally different.
Yep. And you have to keep it up then if you kind of switch, then that's...
Yeah.
So I end up mostly just reading and listening to German. I don't often speak it.
Yeah. I would imagine that a lot of families, especially after World War II, just the embarrassment of speaking German would, a lot of them wouldn't even teach their kids German, but I mean, if they did, then it's kind of like a quiet thing of, I'll speak it every now and then, but probably not very often. Right.
Or if they have family that didn't move over or, on the phone a little bit.
Yeah.
That was like my wife's grandmother spoke German as a native language, but when she moved to the U.S., she, didn't use it for 50 years.
Wow.
Except when she, called her sister or her family that still back in Germany. So.
Yeah, it's always wild for me to compare that and think, if I would just go to another country and just stop speaking English and then just speak that language and then only ever use English for, those, conversations with the relatives. And I mean, I could do it, but would I do it is another question. And then it's like...
And in Germany, it's particularly hard because their English is so good. So I didn't say the most recent time I was in Germany, I was in Berlin. It would have been like 2018 I was teaching a May semester course with another professor at Indiana University, and we took about 20 American college students at IU over to Berlin to teach a course on, it wasn't for German speakers, it was taught in English, but it was about the history of Berlin and the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, dealing with your past as a country, as a city. So I was there for a month, but once again, especially in Berlin, so English heavy. Sometimes it feels like, or I've heard it said, I didn't come up with this, it sometimes feels like being in a giant airport. Yeah. And so it depends on where you are in Germany, but sometimes if your German really isn't up to snuff, you'll go there and you'll try it out in a shop or something, and they'll just immediately switch to English. Because it's...
They say, Berlin isn't Germany, it's Berlin.
Don't get me wrong, I loved Berlin. I didn't expect to like it because I don't normally like big cities, but it didn't feel big. It was really nice. I enjoyed my time there.
I always forget that it's not just a city, but also a state. So, it's Berlin, and then inside of Berlin again,
Yeah.
Normally, I'm used to here where, the capital's pretty much almost exclusively different from where it's at, with a few notable exceptions, but, almost never. But then overseas, it's like, kind of like, Moscow is like a city and a state, the state of Moscow. So, yeah, very, very fascinating stuff. So my first English question is, how did you learn German?
So I did not start learning German. Sorry. Wait, I'm up. I did not start learning German until college. My high school didn't offer German. They offered French and Spanish and Latin. And that's what I did when I was in high school. I took as many as were offered. Two friends and I even finagled our way into letting the administration let us do a year independent study of Greek. So German was sort of something that seemed a bit different, something I had encountered before, had the opportunity to study officially, in a classroom. And so when I went to undergrad, didn't offer many languages. It was only French, Spanish, and German. And I had done French and Spanish already. Wasn't fluent in them, but had experience with them. And so I wanted the new thing, the different thing. And so I ended up just like the first semester declaring a German major. And so I learned kind of there from the beginning. So it was really just the classroom. I was a fairly good student. I don't remember being super industrious about my German studying. I think it was mostly kind of reserved for the classroom and then studying as much as I needed to do well on the quizzes and the tests. The study abroad really helped. That got me up to about, at least a low B2 level on the European scale. So conversational. And then what really helped, was then going to grad school in a German studies department where I was going to teach German. And that really sort of ramped up the pressure. It's like, okay, yes, I'm conversational, I'm fairly good at this, I can, but now I'm going to be teaching it. And I need to be able to conduct an entire class in German. And that pressure and that experience and that sort of responsibility with it really then kind of kicked it into overdrive. And then I feel like I really did get more comfortable with it. And then all the coursework, there were some seminars we took that were totally in German, talking about novels and literary theory in German and, sorts of things like that. So.
Yeah. In my experience, German was different. I went to high school. We did have German there. Like the language you mentioned, we had French, German, and Spanish. Technically, we had Latin, but I don't think anyone counts that because it was an online class and no one actually taught it. It's just like...
they didn't have any boots on the ground.
No. No, my band director taught it. Okay. It's kind of funny. He didn't know any Latin. But yeah, I took Spanish in high school because I had taken Spanish in middle school, and I was lazy. I didn't want to do any extra work, and I knew the Spanish classes in high school were going to be fairly easy. Yeah. And so I was trying to kind of pick classes that didn't really require too much effort just so I could get through, to be honest. Fair enough, yeah. So languages weren't my thing at the time. And I had a couple of people I knew were taking German. Actually, a friend of mine was taking it. I was like, why would anyone take German? Because I can understand why. Spanish, obviously, because you have, how many millions of people in here that can speak Spanish or speak it natively. And French, because, well, Canada's next door and Quebec at least, or, so seldom parts of the U.S. where you have at least some groups that maybe you could think of the Creole people in New Orleans or, New York or something like that. But German, when I left high school, I actually visited an aunt of mine, and she told me she was born on a military base in Germany and that she actually used to know some German. And I thought, that's curious. I wonder what it's like. So I started looking at basic stuff like colors, numbers, stuff that you could learn in your sleep. And immediately I noticed that, hey, I can look at these colors and just guess what they are. And bam, blau is blue. Rot, that's probably red.
It's probably red, yeah.
Starts with an R, ends with a consonant, it has a vowel in the middle, it's probably red. And I was like, wow. So I started looking up the, relationship between English and other languages, and that led me down a rabbit hole of just learning about Germanic languages. And eventually, after enough curiosity and learning about them, I guess began to actually take some steps to figure out what methods of learning worked for me, because I had never successfully learned any other language before, not on my own. I had the classes and stuff like that, but that never got me to conversational level, the classes for Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for me it was mostly the work I was doing outside of class. Other than the 2.5 months abroad, I was for years, I was just an Anki freak. Do you know Anki, the app, the flashcard app? Yeah. I mean, a friend introduced me to that, and probably for 5 years, I was doing, every day consistently with all the languages that I'd studied, and, it was the only way I could feasibly manage keeping them up to, somewhat consistently. And that was, I don't know, that worked for me. It certainly wouldn't work for everybody, but just going through every day chunks of phrases and things like that, I feel like it really kept my vocabulary up. I don't really do it. I haven't touched Anki in probably 2 years now. I have a lot of backlogged cards now to go through, but
I used that app for a little bit, but it really helped, and I didn't expect this, but science fiction, because when I first began to watch things and material in German, I immediately noticed that I did not have access to that because it was too difficult. The vocabulary was too advanced, diction, and then I returned to it after I was more advanced, and it helped a lot.
Yeah. I mean, if you bite off too much at the beginning, it's going to wear you down, because nobody wants to read a page and have to look up 70% of the words on the I've tried that before. That doesn't work for me. But ultimately, it's about, there's not, the right method. The right method is, the one that will get you to do it. Yeah. The one that interests you and will actually get you interacting with the language, which for me has mostly been books and flashcards. German speakers using English very, very frequently, which some people kind of mourn then the loss of, German or whatever. They don't want things to change, but I think it's great. It's fine. But it does it's a little bit weird than teaching German. If a student's like, well, how do I say this in German? And I say, well, they actually probably use the English word for that. No, okay. Some are super excited about that. Some are like,
Yeah.
So it can be weird. And sometimes they have like, they'll borrow a word, but the meaning will change slightly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. It won't be exactly one for one, exactly how we use it.
Yeah. You see this throughout history. I mean, you know, a lot of the words that we use in English are a consequence of a sort of battle between, okay, are we going to use the Norse word or are we going to use the West Germanic word, right?
Right.
And then are we going to use the Germanic word or are we going to use a Latin word which may sound a bit more fancy?
Yeah.
You know, so...
And it's fun. Like I said, I'm totally fine with it. I mean, I think it's great and whimsical, and it's really interesting to see which words they latch onto to use and which ones they don't. I mean, I think the Duden word of the year last year, I don't know, you'd have to look that up, but I think it was cringe.
Ah, yeah.
Well, that is cringe.
Yeah, that's being used like overall. Even in South America, they're like adding cringe, that into.
It's a good one, but I remember coming in and teaching the middle schoolers German, like the first year at Baylor, and one of the first things they asked, how do you say sleigh in German? I was like, no, they would just say sleigh, because I mean, like there is a verb for that, but it's really just an idiom.
Yeah. It's a Norwegian word called stuvnenutter, which is date. So, instead of using that word, they would just rather use the English term for it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, right. So, your college, what you studied, and why, including philosophy?
Yeah, so I've always been sort of clearly on the humanities side of the curriculum. I didn't do particularly well with maths and sciences, and I like words a lot. So in undergrad, I tried to cast as wide a net as possible. And so my major was German studies, which was sort of a thing that they cobbled together for me on request, which was sort of like half history, half political science. Well, not half and half, but it was a mix of history, political science, and German language classes. And I liked that. And then I minored in philosophy and linguistics. And then I can't remember if it was actually made official. I had enough credits for a history minor as well, but sometimes they don't let you double dip with credits. Yeah. So, I was trying to do a lot of things. Because I wasn't sure which way I wanted to go. I had a good idea. I wanted to go to grad school, be a teacher, be a professor. So I was trying to keep sort of a wide berth on things, keep my options open. And I enjoyed all of those things. And I think they all complemented each other well. As far as, why I, chose those, there are, language and history are some connection points between them. I think I chose disciplines that I felt like, for some reason, I think I've always had a sort of suspicion that there's this, like secret thing that some people know out there. There's some knowledge that I don't have, and I want to go find out what it is. That's how I kind of explain it to myself now, because, that explains at least, language. How does it work? It's one of the basis of how we communicate and live in the world. Foreign languages, that's I can't understand what they're saying. Maybe they're saying something really cool and I want to know what it is. And, philosophy is, it seems like if there were people that had secret answers about, life and whatever, that's one decent place to look. And so I think I got myself into all these disciplines trying to find that. And it was good, I don't think I can say I found that. But I did find a lot of cool stuff and a lot of interesting stuff, and I've liked being on that track. And I think even though I had to sort of narrow a bit more in grad school, I feel like I still incorporate all of those different things into what I do when I teach. Literature, history, philosophy, language, linguistics.
Philosophy is fascinating because when you go down that rabbit hole and you get into it, you realize pretty much everything is philosophy.
Yeah. Or we could be a little bit more cynical and say at least philosophers think they have a right to comment on everything. Else, it might have something to say about it, but it can be a little bit like philosophers are the arbiters of every other discipline. And
it's like you can either explicitly talk about philosophy or you can demonstrate it through, like Dostoevsky used to write stories that would show you his worldview, but like through almost more clearly in a way, because you saw how it played out in contrast to other philosophers. Nietzsche kind of did both. He could write stories, but he would often talk about what he thought.
Yeah, he has very poetic prose. It's not what you think of as philosophy proper, right? Very sort of neat and orderly and systematic, and that's why I think I edged more and more towards literature, and sort of this meeting point between philosophy and literature. Like the philosophy that I was doing and was interested in wasn't sort of the paradigmatic like logic and sort of syllogisms and things like that. I was more interested in what would broadly be called as like the continental tradition, where it's philosophers writing more about the history of thought, about, works of literature, about art. It felt more like, now it would fall under the umbrella of what we call theory, which is often actually taught in literature departments at universities rather than in philosophy departments. Philosophers might look at that and say, that's not philosophy. And so there's this little conflict. So I didn't end up in a philosophy department. I ended up in a foreign language / literature linguistics department. So I was kind of at home there.
You can even really kind of think of George Lucas as a philosopher, laying philosophy, I guess,
Yeah, narrative is very, very effective for that, often more so than just like argument, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
Giving people an image of something. At least for me, images are so powerful. It's how I remember things. It's how I engage with things. And so that'll always be, I think, more impactful for me.
This isn't one of my questions, but did you ever use or feature imagery as a core part of your process for language learning?
Oh, I don't think so. Actually, no, I mean, not explicitly. No, it was very much just focusing, to the extent that I was reading books, and the books had, novels present you with images, but there wasn't anything where I was explicitly incorporating like image. Like, for instance, some people on their flashcards have, especially digital flashcards, have pictures on them. Yeah. I didn't do that. It was just the phrase.
Yeah.
So no, to that extent, I think I end up just talking to myself a lot. I kind of tell my students, like, just mutter under your breath all the time. Like, you have to actually use those muscles and create the muscle memory of speaking the words. You can't, it'd be like trying to play an instrument by just listening.
Yeah.
Like you have to actually make the movements in order to make them more fluid, right? And so I'm just I was for years just muttering under my breath. And it was great because sometimes I rode the bus to campus and, I'm sitting there with my flashcards muttering to myself, and like nobody wants to come sit next to me. I'll just like, who's that crazy guy? So
it's kind of like when you get to a point where you can understand it and it's useful for you, because the problem with language is that it's only useful when you understand it. Like when you hear it, it's not useful until you can interpret it in your mind. And when you get to that point, it's sort of like you're hearing it twice. Yeah. Because you're hearing it once. At first, when a person speaks French and there's other people in the room, everyone hears what the person's saying. Right. But only the person who can understand them hears it twice, because then they have that vocabulary embedded in their mind. And then, so when the person's talking, they're pulling from their passive vocabulary in order to understand what the person is saying. And then it's like when you talk, then you're pulling from your passive vocabulary, and you're, if you're not speaking gibberish and just saying a bunch of random stuff, intentionally, you're also hearing something twice because you're saying it and then you're listening to yourself.
Right. And as far as listening to things, that aren't comprehensible, I have done that before, learning various languages, but specifically I had a specific, purpose for that, which was listening to natural spoken, parts of the language in order to get my ear used to identifying word breaks and the cadence and the intonation, right? Because languages have different cadences and the pitch with your sentence. And also part of the battle when you're trying to develop your listening comprehension is, well, where does one word end and the other word start? It's not, because languages have different phonologies. It's not actually clear a lot of the time when you're first starting out. And so even if the input isn't comprehensible to you at the beginning, I think it is worthwhile to just kind of passively have it on. I think your brain does start to recognize, where to find those word breaks, and that'll ultimately then help you later on. Once you've figured out where the word's broken off, then you can identify it as a lexical, word in your brain with a meaning and with a context. And
that was often something I noticed about native German speakers who would try to speak Spanish. They would actually treat Spanish often like their native language, in that you would hear them separate the words deliberately instead of do what the native Spanish speakers do, which is kind of mold over the ends of words with vowels with the word with the next words, which would often have a vowel at the beginning and make it sound like one word. So a continuous sentence, and also like then the native Spanish speakers just ignoring some of the consonants, which I can imagine is pretty frustrating for a native German speaker. That was always something that was more appealing to me about beginning to speak German, was the concentration on consonants made it easier to decipher when a word was a word, instead of having to, constantly, cut. Okay, when look up. Okay, that's the word she was saying. Spanish just makes it a lot more difficult than that. Even though I would say, reading Spanish and German are both pretty straightforward. You look at it, but hearing it, man, it's just German is much more easier to listen to in that way. I would say, for me at least, it was. That was the case. So, let's see. Your teaching experience as a grad student.
So that was at Indiana University, Bloomington. I was there for a total of 7 years, doing a master's and most of a PhD. I actually didn't defend my dissertation, passed my quals and did my coursework, but decided that I didn't want to go through with the dissertation. But anyway, so I was there for 7 years and taught for 4 of those years. The other 3 years, I was fortunate enough to get a fellowships where I just got paid to either take certain classes or do research. Didn't have to teach. So I taught for 4 years, though, and a couple summers. All sorts of German language classes from 100 level up to 400 level. I taught a number of courses in English as well, so a course on fairy tales in the German tradition, a course on Syrian refugees in Germany, a course on, what did we call it? It was, some of these were co-taught with other professors in the department, so we kind of, we did some team teaching. one was, we called it Bombing Civilians, or that's what the professor titled it. It's a history of air warfare in the 20th century. And really it was sort of a half history, half moral philosophy course. We were focusing on the firebombing of Hamburg.
Very direct name.
Yeah, very right. So, I mean, that was the moral question, is bombing civilians in wartime an acceptable or justifiable action, and to what extent, right? So that's what we were diving into, but looking at the case study of the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943. Let's see. Yeah, it's a few other one-off things, but it was a pretty varied curriculum that I got to teach, and I think that's actually pretty rare for a grad student experience. And like for the German language courses, we were the instructor of record, so we were ultimately responsible. Like we weren't just a TA. Like we did the syllabus and the curriculum and the planning and the grading and everything, and that was an awesome experience. I was super young when I started it. The blackboard added a few years, which I think helped. They thought I was older than I was, because it was a bit odd. I liked teaching the students there. It was a good experience. I mean, I felt like I connected with a lot of the students. I got good feedback from them as far as class being enjoyable and manageable, and getting a few at least excited about language learning, or at least doing something to rectify the horrible experience that they had in high school, with learning languages, which for me is a huge boon. Like if I could even do that, to just put the idea in their head again of, no, it can be okay. It doesn't have to be just mind-numbing worksheets. So I would say it was a great experience. I mean, I got to work with my peers, other grad students, and we had a language director who was a professor in the department who sort of oversaw all of us and gave some direction to us and to the curriculum. So
now the Brothers Grimm, is that originally German? Brüder Grimm? Was that one stuff that you went over, for example?
So yeah, and that course was taught in English, so it wasn't for German speakers. We read everything in translation, but it was focusing on German culture, because the Grimm brothers published their fairy tales before Germany was united as a country for the first time. So they published the first edition in 1812, but the German Empire didn't unify until 1871. And so one of the big things that some Germans thought brought them together were the stories that they shared. And so the Grimm brothers fairy tales were this very important cultural piece, that was sort of to some people it seemed to act as like a sort of ersatz, like a proxy for not having a country, but having a people that's united by language and story. So we talked about that. We ended up talking a lot about how Disney took a lot of those stories and adapted them for kind of modern adolescent audiences, and the changes that they had to make and why they did that. And so that was a lot of fun.
I think some of those tales were a bit adult in nature.
That's definitely how we would view them now, because they came out of a pretty wretched circumstances sometimes. I mean, one of the key things that you find in a lot of the stories is it starts with there's a famine, and they got to do something, and the parents are wondering if they can feed their kids. And so they got to get out of the situation somehow. Right? That's how a lot of the stories end up starting.
Yeah, man. That reminds me of the fact where the reason why we call Dutch, because the term predates Germany, and so what really happened was it was supposed to be cognate with Deutsch.
Which Deutsch, yeah.
But then Germany came into existence, and that's why we call it. But fascinating stuff. Well, that's why the Pennsylvania Dutch is still German.
Right, still German, even though it's,
So you're transitioning from teaching German to English at Baylor.
Right. So this is this past year, which is my second year at Baylor, I did roughly half and half. I did two German courses and 3 English courses. So I was kind of straddling both departments this past year. And, talked to the dean of faculty and requested, and I said, I think it's time. I'd like to be able to move to 100% English if that's possible. And they made that happen. And I was very thankful for that. Now I will be an English teacher from here on out. I'm happy about that.
Yeah, we talked about that some. I think immediately in my mind, because this was all before I even knew that there was even going to be a new German teacher to,
Right, well, to cover the sections that I'm, and giving up,
I was kind of worried about, oh, man, they're going to get rid of German. But, I see.
No, Baylor they've committed they want to keep the 5 languages that they teach, and so,
English,
going to make that happen.
French, German, Spanish, and Latin.
English. No, well, English not counting 5 foreign languages, or world languages, as we call them. So French, Spanish, German, Latin, Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There they go, competing with Macaulay again. Huh?
Well, I'm so jealous of these 6th graders that get to come in, and the 6th grade year, they do like a language sampling. It's a rotation, and so they get about a month and a half with each of the 5 languages that we offer, and they get to kind of just try it out, see what it's like, and then they make their decision then for 7th grade, like what one do they want to take, and they're in that for 7th and 8th grade. And then if they decide when they move to upper school, if it's not really working out, they want to do something else, then they can switch. I'm super jealous that they have that opportunity.
Yeah. It sounds really cool. One of the questions on my mind regarding, because your experience with how you study at the university, to me, varies quite significantly from, let's say, the typical person who gets a degree in order to teach English, right?
Yeah.
And so, and we alluded to this before, although not on the podcast, but, I suppose I was going to ask you one more time for the video, like, what do you think makes you stand out or makes you unique as in contrast to those people regarding English teaching?
Yeah, I think, in general, I've kind of come to teaching English sort of through the back door, right? Not like, if you looked at my college transcript, I don't think there would be any course with a prefix ENG English in front of it. However, you look at the coursework for my PhD program, a lot of the courses were literature courses, but they were done in a German department. So we were talking about German literature often, but we were also reading novels from in translation from other parts of Europe. And I had kind of always wanted to read widely myself. And so, I have this sort of weird indirect experience. And then the other piece is the linguistics piece that I think it would be fair to say a lot of, high school English teachers don't have that background necessarily. They took English courses that were more literature-based, not linguistics-based. But my master's at Indiana University was in Germanic studies, I think is the actual thing on the piece of paper. But essentially it was like historical Germanic linguistics, of which English is a Germanic language, right? So it's English's family. And so the one thing that gave me is a very comparative approach to world languages, right? And so not focusing exclusively on English, I do think that wider perspective has certain effects in the classroom when I teach English. What I mean by that is linguists are, there's a couple of broad ways I'd characterize it. One is linguists are descriptivists, where English teachers tend to be prescriptivists. What I mean by that is linguists are generally interested. They're not interested at all in telling people how to talk or like the correct way to talk. They're interested in how do people talk, right? And tend to just find that fascinating. And that's where I'm coming from. The sort of very stereotypical English teacher, right, is the one who is, correcting people's speech. Of course, they're not all like that, but, the one that's going to correct your who and whom, the one that's going to correct your, me and him versus he and I, and I don't look at language that way. I mean, of course, if I'm grading written English, like for formal essays, you need to use standard written conventions, but ultimately, I'm not content with just telling students, you need to do it the right way. I'm much more interested in pushing them to ask questions. Okay, when I write this way, using this word or this construction, what effect does that have on the reader or on the listener? If I'm grading an essay, for example, right, my comment to a student who's using a strange grammatical construction is not, this is wrong, right? It's that this is not the best construction to use in this context, in this register of writing a formal paper, right? And so it does irk me quite a bit when an English teacher or anyone says that, the way a native speaker of a language is speaking is wrong. Yeah. From a linguist perspective, that's not true at all. I mean, if someone's a native speaker of a language, they're speaking correctly. They're speaking fluently. It might not be a dialect or a register of that language that you recognize as the standard one, but standard of any language, whether it's German, whether it's English, whether it's whatever, standard itself is a dialect. It's not as if there's the standard and then there are deviations. When you look at the history of language, the standard dialect is just one of many that then developed and for certain social reasons became the standard, right? It's sort of a contingency of history rather than sort of there was this perfect version of the language and then people just didn't know how to speak it correctly or they got lazy. Language is always changing, and so you get this. And that's what I find fascinating, so I try and, instead of getting students to think of right and wrong, try to get them to think a bit deeper about how the way they say things has an effect. Because sometimes you don't want to use the standard language. It can actually be, if your friend's going through a hard time, you're kind of hashing it out, you're talking, and you start using very formal constructions in your speech, well, that can create distance between you and them, right? So it doesn't, and even on the flip side, sometimes using informal phrases in a formal speech or lecture can have a certain effect, positive effect on the audience. And so ultimately, I think that's a much deeper way of looking at language. And that also has all other sorts of ramifications. So, I think I love grammar, the way I teach, because I'm fascinated with the way that different languages sort of carve out reality through the way they do their grammar systems. And so I think it would be fair to say that the way I teach grammar is a bit different than sort of a traditional English teacher. So at least from what I observe, it seems like some English teachers teach English as if it were a foreign language. Like the way that they analyze it and break it down and really emphasize these jargony technical words of knowing what a subordinating conjunction is. For me, instead of teaching English as if it were a foreign language, I lean into the fact that I'm teaching all of these students for whom English is their native language. They already speak it fluently. What they need to learn is how to code switch between dialects of standard and informal and, these different social registers. And so, I teach the technical jargon as much as is necessary because I'm not going to be their only English teacher. You know, they're going to have other teachers that teach this way. But for me, you know, I say, okay, this is a subordinating conjunction. It'll link an independent and a dependent clause. But really what you need to know is that it's any word or phrase that starts a dependent clause, one that can't stand on its own, right? So the difference between he went to the store, that's an independent clause. It can stand on its own. It's a complete sentence, right? Put a word in front of it. When he went to the store, it's suddenly a dependent. Like you want to know when he went to the store, what happened, right? And so instead of sort of objectifying language in a way that makes it weird and mysterious, I really tell students to lean into their gut intuition, right? Like when they hear the phrase, although he went to the store, they should feel this like sinking feeling in their stomach a little bit, like, well, what? You know, and so then they know it's a dependent clause. They don't have to memorize any rules. They can intuitively feel out the grammar. And it's possible that lots of people do that. I haven't really seen it too much. And so the same thing with parts of speech. So, you know, the way we teach parts of speech, noun, verb, adjective, that sort of thing, like, you know, it can be somewhat effective, but sometimes has its pitfalls. Like it's, you know, would be very typical, I think, to ask a student, what's a verb? They'll say, well, it's an action. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, yeah, like, I don't know, 60% of the time that'll get you there. But that's not really what a verb does in English. Like, what's its function? If you look at it linguistically, a verb's function is to relate things in the world together. It's actually it's a relational term. So what I mean by that is like, so if you had a sentence like, running is awful. I don't like running. So running is awful. And you tell kids, okay, the verb is the action. And you say, okay, in that sentence, which one's the action? They're going to say running. But running's not the verb in that sentence. Is the verb. Running is a verbal noun, a gerund, right? And so is the verb. It's the thing that relates running with awful, right? And so a lot of times these set ways that we memorize things when we're not looking at language comparatively and descriptively can sort of really make things more mysterious than they need to be. That's how I would put it.
Fair enough. Is that also derived out of your own experience having taken classes from teachers?
Yeah, I mean, from my linguistics professors, not from literature teachers. So, you know, there really is this divide between descriptive and prescriptive rules for language. And I mean, I obviously can't take credit for most of the stuff inside my head in the way I do things, but because it comes from so many sources, most of which I'm not even aware of. But this really is kind of just, I'm giving students the way that I think about language, the way that I'm convinced that it works through my study of a plurality of languages, from a study of how languages change over, you know, a millennium, right? Because you encounter so many myths about language, about how, well, you know, it's all slang now, or slang's ruining English or whatever. But people don't realize that, one, all languages in the world are changing constantly. There's nothing we can do about it. It has been doing that since languages have been around. And what is today's standard was a couple hundred years ago slang. And so really it's just our perspective that's sort of messing things up. It seems new and erroneous to us, but in 100 years from now, that very well could be the standard, and it's fine. Like, no, if you ask someone, like, you know, reading Beowulf in Old English, like, you know, if you asked just an average English speaker, if they like read a page of it and said, well, aren't you sad that you don't speak that way anymore? What we gardena in Jahrdarum, right? It's like, no, you know, any English speaker that's complaining about the demise of the language is not upset that they don't speak that way anymore. And so it doesn't make sense to me. You know, it's always changing. I'm interested in how it's changing and becoming fluent and competent in those new variables that are getting added. So, and I try to encourage students to, and my colleagues to do the same.
That makes a lot of sense. I actually tried to read Beowulf in Old English for the first time 2017, 18 or so. That was when I was just beginning to really learn about other Germanic languages and start dabbling in what I could find out about them. And I realized that I had confused Old English with Middle English.
Yep.
I thought, that Shakespearean English was Old English.
Because of the linguist in me, the first thing that I teach so I taught Romeo and Juliet with 8th grade and Twelfth Night with 9th grade this year in my English courses. And almost the first thing I went over with them is I said, what language are Shakespeare's plays written in? And a lot of people said Old English, right? And I said, no, let's back up. So I showed them, Beowulf. And then I showed them, I said, that's Old English. You can't understand a word of that. And then I showed them Middle English, something from Chaucer. And I said, okay, that's it's still a bit weird. You can't really make heads or tails of a lot of it, but it's a little bit better. And then I showed them, King James English, Shakespeare. I said, this is what we call early modern English. And so I kind of start out that way. Because, people, it's just common parlance. I mean, it's understandable. Yes, it's older English than is spoken now, but it's one of those things where if you're in the field, then you use the technical language. If you're not, it makes sense that people would call it Old English, but it's not.
I think J.R.R. Tolkien was the one who translated it, wasn't he?
Well, a lot of people have translated it. There are actually even very, very recent translations that have come out. But Tolkien's role because he was a philologist by training, so studying old languages and cultures, his role in Beowulf studies was to sort of create new interest in it as a literary piece. Like before Tolkien came on the scene, at least the trend for a while had been, okay, Beowulf is interesting for historical reasons, but not really for literary reasons. And Tolkien kind of said, no, it's actually a fantastic epic poem. We need to look at these literary pieces and look at it a different way. I think his essay is called The Monster and Its Critics or something like that. It's been a while since I read it. But he did a lot for Beowulf studies. And
Tolkien was a fascinating character. He spoke 9 languages to my knowledge.
Yeah, and I know he dabbled, or more than dabbled, in many others. It was sort of his, and obviously created a lot.
I believe he was inspired to write The Lord of the Rings from studying Finnish mythology, which...
That makes sense.
And
I know he liked Finnish, I know he liked Welsh, and I know he liked Gothic.
Well, it's crazy because Finnish, Hungarian, and Estonian are 3 languages that they're not even derived from the continent of Europe at all.
Right.
And... the idea that he spent that much time invested in that language is crazy because not only that, Finnish specifically, as opposed to Estonian, has almost no words incorporated from any Indo-European language in it.
Right.
So very few cognate words.
Right. It's totally different. I mean, and if I had, many lifetimes, I love the sound of Finnish and Hungarian and Estonian. I'd love to do it, but it's just not, life slips away. You don't have time for everything. You have to give up things.
It is a time thing, and that's why with my language learning process, I immediately became obsessed with the idea of finding a way to use etymology to your advantage because it's a time thing as well. And I was having a conversation with. We alluded to it on my last podcast. I was telling her, if you're a native Spanish speaker and you want to learn some other languages, theoretically, it would be in your interest to learn about how the other Latin languages relate to yours. It's because if you're a native Spanish speaker, you only have to learn a little bit about Portuguese to begin to start reading it and then you just jump into the literature, after you learn how to pronounce everything, and you'd be surprised in
it's
a few months.
so quick. Yeah, like that.
People put themselves through way more trouble than they need to.
Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, back when I was in like high school and undergrad was really when I was going through like my, in the beginning of grad school, I was going through like my polyglot phase. Like I really wanted to do as many languages as possible, and I ended up doing a lot, for at least like a year, not getting proficient in them, but I was like dabbling in a lot of them, and I couldn't sit still, and I would and there were good things that came from that. One is this sort of larger typological comparative perspective on world languages. And I wouldn't give that up. That was really cool. And I'm glad that I have that experience. But ultimately, like, life encroaches. And unless you're living like a grad student schedule, which is a pretty free schedule, a lot of free time. At least I don't know. I can't speak for other people. I had a lot of free time. Unless your life continues that way, you really need to you're going to have to sacrifice some things. Like I used to do Anki for all my languages every day. Now I just don't, in some ways I barely keep up with German because I have other, it's okay. I like reading philosophy. I like reading novels. And they're not necessarily in German, they're originally in English. And so I want to read them in English. So yeah, I've definitely narrowed over the years in terms of languages that I actively work with, on a weekly basis, monthly basis.
Yeah, I understand. There was a few languages that I really, really wanted to get my hands on, but it's either, I'm just going to have to wait, or, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Mm-hmm. Like, I wanted, years ago, as I began to learn about the other Germanic languages, I was really fascinated with, things like Frisian. Man, if I could just learn this. Right. And there's Western Frisian and which type of Frisian are you wanting to learn? Right. But either way, there really isn't a lot. Unless you're in the Netherlands or in the top of Germany, and you can really go to those libraries and find those. Right. Books are in the corner of the world. It's just going to be really hard.
You need people to talk to, and that's what it ended up being. I mean, I think it took me years to realize this, but trying to really sit down and think about my motivation for trying out all these different languages, and when push came to shove, it wasn't enough motivation for it to just be a personal, internal thing of, well, wouldn't it be cool to know this language? That was kind of how I ended up thinking about it a lot of times. But, when you're talking about a time commitment of years, that's not enough, gas in the fire to keep you going. If there's if there aren't tons and tons of books I want to read in that language, if there aren't people that I'm close to that I want to talk to in that language, if it's not a place that I really want to go spend time with, or would be too expensive or unfeasible to go spend time in, if I don't have any shows or movies that I like to watch in that language, then really there's not going to be anything that's going to keep me going when it gets hard and monotonous, which it inevitably, anything you do for that long and that intensely will get that way. And so a lot of my languages have dropped off, and even German to that extent, because there just aren't people that I really use it with. So it's sad, but also freeing in a way. I mean, I have time for other things than like reading things that I like to read.
And although there was once a time where I wondered how families could lose the languages of their cultures, I no longer really wonder that now. My own struggle to keep my languages up, having acquired them, I go through phases of being able to even use my Spanish. There are times where I feel pretty confident and am able to speak it better, and times where I really do have to kind of listen to an extra podcast or so.
Right, you gotta kind of refresh it and warm it up a little bit. And luckily, then a lot of the passive knowledge will stay there for a while, depending on how deep you got into the language. And so I'm not ever worried. While I don't have plans to maintain my German now that I'm not teaching it anymore. Because that's a natural way to keep it up. But now that I'm not teaching it, I don't really have any plans. But I've also kind of made peace with the fact, like, even if my proficiency really starts to dwindle, like, if I need it, I'd be able to get it back fairly quickly, you know, just by then interacting with it more. And then because whatever that would be, there would be some external motivation, like, oh, I need to do this again, or I want to do this again.
Yeah, and that happens to people too. I actually had several conversations with a gentleman who was born in Russia but grew up here. So his native language is actually Russian, but because he grew up most of his life in the States, he just really didn't have a strong memory of his Russian, and he spent many years getting it back. But innately, the language was easier for him to learn than other Americans because he still had it as like somewhat of a foundation.
Right.
You know?
Oh, totally. I mean, you're right. It can come back, but it is surprising that you can actually. Some people do get to the point of almost forgetting their native language if they're deprived of it long enough. It's there in the back of their head, but you can lose it more than you think you could. We think of those as pretty permanent things, but language is a very, I don't know, ephemeral or temporary thing. Like, it only survives as long as you use it, right? As long as you use it. And if I'm trying to get students excited about English class now it's English class, you know, I tell them, like, every time you use a word, you're keeping it alive just a little bit longer, you know? So, like, think about that. Like, I don't know, for me, that's really exciting.
It's fascinating. It really is, you know. It's mind-boggling for, especially, I would say, native English speaker in a world where English is the lingua franca and everybody wants to learn it. It's almost hard to fathom that, you know, it's possible that you could lose that. But I've even experienced
English
that,
would be harder.
I mean, I've even experienced that. Well, not my vocabulary necessarily, but I mean, there are some times where I felt like the sharpness of my vocabulary was slipping away due to other languages, but mostly spelling. So as a kid, I was very good at spelling. But when I began to pick up some other languages, and now I concern myself with German and now Dutch, and my spelling went out the window, like just terrible.
That's funny. I'm like the opposite. I was an abysmal speller growing up because I didn't read, actually. I didn't voluntarily read anything until like 11th grade, actually. I mean, I could. My mom made sure I could. She sat me down every day when I was little. We're going to practice reading. But I didn't like it, and I didn't do it. I had a fairly good sizable vocabulary for spoken English, but because I wasn't a reader, I never really saw it written down. And so I was just a terrible speller. But as I started reading a lot, you know, my spelling naturally got better. Studying other languages, it's, you know, cognates help and these sorts of things. So now my spelling's improved over time just through reading. But because, like you were saying, that does things for your vocabulary too, right? Like, definitely. There are frequency studies of words and, you know, like diversity of lexicon, like different words that you use, and you comparing spoken language with written language. You know, there are so many more words that show up in written language in books and novels and whatever than occur in spoken language. So by reading, you really, really do increase the size of your working vocabulary.
Yeah, and also I think the main thing that made spelling more difficult over time for me was the words that so many words exist across languages that you use. Like, I mean, in English, we sort of have this weird thing where we kind of use our own words separately from other languages. But, you know, like in German, bibliothek, you know, you have that in Spanish.
Right,
Spanish, it's biblioteca, and in other languages, it's the same, but you spell it slightly differently.
I mean, and part of that issue, I think, is like your brain, it seems, people that study language acquisition, it seems to be the case. I mean, obviously, this is sort of metaphorical, but like your your brain creates compartments for languages that you are very proficient in. So like, your native language has its own compartment, but like if you're studying multiple other foreign languages, they kind of share a compartment.
Yeah, you have to build that
you
wall.
have to build those kind of walls between them. And so, it's very easy to mix them up, especially if they're close together.
Yeah.
It's a cognate word. And yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, let's see, my next question. We don't have that many to go, really.
I can be more concise, too.
Let's see. How have you maintained your German thus far, and what do you plan to do about it? You really kind of explained that.
Just reading, basically, is the primary means.
Then the next question is, your pros and cons of being or having been a teacher.
Yeah, so more of a general question, teaching. So I've been teaching about a decade now. The pros are just like, I've been basically in classrooms for most of my life. I went straight from undergrad to grad school to teach. So like, I never really left school once I started. And I just love being in a classroom. It has like this sort of energy. It gives me energy. I like going in. I like interacting with students. I like sometimes having a captive audience when I'm talking about things that I enjoy and find fascinating. And I think of it as a job that's paying me to talk about things that I like. That's a pretty cool thing. It seems fairly rare. There's the other odd, summers off are nice. I really relish those, but that's because the school year itself is so grueling. That gets more into the cons side. But the pros, interacting with my students is just awesome. Like in most cases, when seeing their curiosity about things, when they ask questions about things, when they seem interested, like there are so few things in the world that give me that sort of encouragement and energy. It's very like life-giving. So those are the pros, which are pretty substantial. The cons, it's like the workload feels like quite a lot. It's one of those things, like at least the way that I've been teaching, the work doesn't really stop when you go home. Like I'm constantly thinking about lessons and it's constant planning and there's no real like pause button. So that can be grueling at times, especially in certain parts of the year. I think the biggest con is just when there are certain students that just are not interested at all for whatever reason. And trying to get them engaged, also being understanding of the fact that this might just not be the right time and place for them. Maybe they'll be interested in this someday. Maybe they won't. But that's the thing that wears on me the most, is if students really seem like they don't care, or they're not putting forth any sort of effort, or in worst cases like plagiarism and cheating, which I end up dealing with almost every semester since I started teaching. Because then that's like, you spend so much time. It's this ironic sort of situation where the student often does that in order for them to save time, and then it creates a lot of extra time on my end of things, talking to administrators and the student and redoing the assignment, whatever that entails. Those are the not fun things. I don't especially like grading either. I don't like kind of micromanaging students and grading and evaluating them. I would much rather just have a conversation with them and see what they absorbed,
Yeah.
But
a lot of kids are not as good at cheating and plagiarizing as they think.
I really try to warn students on the first day of class, like, especially when you're teaching like foreign language, like essays in English too, and things like that. It's like, you guys have no idea how obvious it is. Like, I'll have like a first semester German student turn in an assignment that they used like Google Translate or something, and they're using grammatical constructions that wouldn't appear until year 4 at least. And it's like, it's so obvious, but they don't know enough of the language to know how obvious it is. On the English teacher side, I'm familiar with their writing and their writing style. If it's markedly different, it stands out, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that too much, but those are the not fun parts. But it's the pleasant and the awesome parts have weighed heavily enough to keep me in it, and I really don't see myself doing anything else.
Why have you chosen to teach middle school students?
So yeah, the bulk of my experience, well, all of my experience before coming to Baylor was teaching undergrads, which is older students. They're legally adults. They there's not a lot of hand holding, and you interact with them pretty much only in class and then office hours. And there are benefits to that, but I think I was missing a sort of more comprehensive, almost give and take relationship with the students, being a bigger part of their day, seeing them develop for longer. Because a lot of times when you're teaching at a university, you have a student for a semester, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it's like by the end of the semester with a class, you're like, oh, we finally got the chemistry just perfect, and we're really ready to go, and then it ends. And that just became so depressing after a while. And so, there were other reasons I decided not to go into teaching university that have to do with, job marketplace and all that sort of thing, which isn't great. But I was interested in working with younger students because I also wanted to help them find out what they might be interested in earlier along. Because one thing I was noticing teaching college students is I'd have a junior take my German class to fulfill their language requirement. And at the end of the semester, they say, oh man, I really like this. I actually wish I could continue on with this, but I can't because I already have this major and I'm a junior and I got to graduate soon. So, too bad it's too late. And that was those felt a bit tragic. And so if I could kind of work with students earlier on to help them very consciously ruminate on what are the things they really like spending time on, I think that would be a worthwhile thing to do.
So is it fair to say that specific aspect is something that you found more rewarding in teaching middle school students?
Yeah, right. I think that has, very much seeing the students grow up more and getting more continuity from semester to semester, year to year, kind of following them through the curriculum is a much more satisfying experience for me. That can have its downsides too, because if you and a student are really not clicking, you're together for at least a year, if not having them next year as well, it can become difficult, but normally it's a great feeling seeing them very drastically develop, their skills and everything like that. It's great.
Yeah. And my last question is, what are some of the most important lessons that you've taken away from your students?
Yeah, in general. So I've taught quite a large span of students, so from 6th grade all the way up to undergraduates, and lots of things in between. And I think if I was to share one of the most surprising things that I've learned from teaching is that I feel like often in school and in classes, age is a very arbitrary way of separating students. What I mean by that is I tend to see students in categories of do they care or do they not care? And for whatever, I'm not, saying if they don't care, it's their fault or they're lazy or something. Maybe there are perfectly good reasons that they're just checked out in class right now. They got family stuff going on, they got different stuff going on, whatever. But what I mean by that is, in my experience so far, I have 6th graders at Baylor that could perform well in the undergraduate courses that I've taught. And I have had undergrads that I think would still struggle. They struggled in undergrad, but would have struggled as well in the middle school classes that I teach. And that a lot of times it's not, I mean, obviously there are prerequisites, taking certain courses before others that you have to build on. But it's amazing how much caring or not caring is a leveler kind of among students' ages. It's kind of fascinating, really. Like, and I have students in 8th grade that they read all the time and they write all the time, and their essays that they turn in are so good. They're like college level. They're like better than a lot of the stuff I was reading in undergrad. So it's like some of the ways we carve up educational space seem actually a bit arbitrary. I mean, there are I think there are plenty of good reasons for not putting a 7th grader in with, 18 to 22-year-olds in the same classroom, but for social reasons, of course. But that's been one fascinating thing, seeing like just because students are older does not mean that they're more engaged or more responsible, or and to that end, I think the other thing I would say that I've learned is, and am still learning, is to not make as many assumptions about students in terms of why they do the things they do, why they like the things that they like, why they say the things that they say. I think before I started teaching, I had a very sort of like privileged upbringing, like no catastrophes, no really trauma that I'd speak of. I was very successful in school, didn't have too many struggles there. So when I first encountered students not turning in their work or not coming to class or in class sort of just on their phones or laptops or, whatever, I was almost like personally affronted by like, why are you doing that? And I think teaching over time has helped me realize that there are any number of reasons for those sorts of things that often are very good reasons and are often reasons that I couldn't even imagine until they tell me. And sometimes they do. And so I'm trying to constantly get better at that, becoming more understanding, not assuming the worst of my students, trying to find other ways to get them engaged. And I think it's been a worthwhile goal for me. And I learn more every year with the new batch of students, new issues, new challenges, new delights as well. Yeah.
Would you say there's any notable differences from your student self and from yourself as you're able to observe yourself today?
So my student self, like my student self and my teacher self, or just like my younger self and my older self? I guess those are kind of, that's splitting hairs, but
subjective, yeah. So how you look at it.
Well, let's see. As a middle school student, if I want to go back that far, I liked being in school for friends and for like just hanging out and having a good time. I was not interested in classes at all. I did not get good grades. I got kind of sent out into the hall or, in trouble every day. Not for like bad, just like talking, distracting other people. It wasn't until high school that something switched. I was like, no, this is awesome. I really care about this. This is probably because this is someplace I can really kind of excel and stand out. That's a big deal in high school if you can find a way to stand out. For some people don't want to stand out. So I really, really leaned heavily into the academic side of things, then starting late high school into college and then grad school. And I think in some ways there's a discontinuity in that I've become a lot more relaxed on things, like things that used to really, really bug me about other, like my co-students or students that when I was a student or students when I'm teaching, I think used to frustrate me or whatever. And now I'm more like a bit more understanding, a bit more relaxed. Like, it's okay. Like, the world doesn't hinge on how this hour 60-minute class goes. It's okay. You know, I'd put so much pressure on it.
Can't tell every teacher that.
Right. You know, it's but one of the continuities is that I think I still really just like spending the time with the materials, and it still really gets me excited. I think my motivations are slightly different. You know, I think I've gotten better at finding things that I'm genuinely interested in, and not just the things that I feel like I should be interested in, or other people expect me to be interested in. And that takes a while for some people, for me to sort of tease out. And I think just trying to find out new ways and new approaches of doing things, like kind of how I'm approaching English class from a linguistics background. I think I was that kind of student too. I was one of the students that would stay after class or go to office hours with a professor and just sit down for like an hour and be like, no, I really don't agree with, you know, how we were talking about this such and such topic in class. Like, let's, you know, I want to talk about this and go about it a different way. So I think that's still there.
Well, fair enough. It was great talking to you.
It was a huge pleasure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Ja. Was für eine Überraschung.
Was für eine Überraschung, dass es mega Spaß gemacht hat, oder?
Dass du so gut durchkamst.
Ja.
Ja, wir hatten Spaß, ich denke.
Ja.